Many people are aware if they have a family history of addiction. At Jackson Laboratory, biologists are investigating the link between addiction and overdose and genetics using lab mice. Grace Bradley takes us to Bar Harbor to hear some of their findings.
It is about breaking that cycle, and sometimes biology can help us do that.
The biology behind addiction and overdose is being investigated at Jackson Laboratory by looking at the behaviors and genetics of mice.
The approach is really novel in that we use a variety of strains of mice, not just one like John Doe, and characterize fully how John Doe responds, because that's not really going to be useful when you try to translate into a population of people.
In our mouse genetic research, and it's not always a case that it comes down to one gene or variant, but what we get to do is examine populations in which everything can be held constant, except in one case we've manipulated one genetic variant.
There are mice that just really like to use this addictive substance, and there are strains that you can't get to use. Others are in the middle. They'll use a little bit. They're kind of the recreational user.
We can start teasing those relationships apart to understand ourselves and each other better, but also to find the biology that we can then use to develop many different approaches to treatment. Some people use that family history information to say, well, this is hopeless. And it really isn't hopeless.
So finding these common themes helps us to identify targets for the development of therapies. They could be pharmacotherapies, or they could be interventions like Tai Chi or meditation.
We have to think about what resources are available to communities, law enforcement, and others to help get people closer to where they need to be to receive the treatment services that they need. Several 100,000 American children have lost a parent to opioid overdose, and this is happening every day in our communities, and we need to understand it. We need to help.
Grace Bradley, WABI TV5 News, Bar Harbor.